Every deal that reshapes the world begins with a crisis. Every empire that endures learns to turn catastrophe into opportunity. And every system of power that lasts for decades understands one fundamental truth. Control the money, control the world. In 1974, as oil prices quadrupled and economies trembled, a secret agreement was struck in the shadows of geopolitics. It wasn't signed in marble halls or announced with fanfare. But this deal would determine which nations rose and which fell for the next 50 years. It would create artificial demand for a single currency, funnel trillions through a chosen financial system, and bind entire regions to the military protection of one superpower. The agreement had a simple name that disguised its revolutionary impact: the petrodollar system. And if you think this is ancient history, you're missing the most important financial story of our time. The crisis that made this deal possible didn't start with oil. It started with the collapse of trust itself. By 1971, the United States faced a problem that no amount of military power could solve. The Bretton Woods system, which had anchored global finance since World War II, was cracking under the weight of American spending. For decades, other nations had accepted dollars as good as gold because America promised to exchange them for actual gold at a fixed rate. But the Vietnam War had forced the Federal Reserve to print money faster than Fort Knox could back it. Foreign governments began demanding their gold, and Nixon faced a choice: honor the promise and watch America's gold reserves vanish, or break the deal and shatter the foundation of international money. On August 15, 1971, Nixon chose to break the promise. The gold window closed forever. The dollar was cut loose from any tangible anchor, floating free on nothing but faith in American power. The immediate consequences were brutal. Without gold backing, the dollar's value began to slide. Other currencies strengthened against it. America's trade balance deteriorated as imports became expensive and exports lost their competitive edge. Inflation crept higher as foreign holders of dollars lost confidence and began dumping them back into American markets. For the first time since World War II, the United States looked financially vulnerable. The world's reserve currency was suddenly just another piece of paper, backed by nothing more than the promises of a government that had already broken its word once. Nixon and his advisors knew they had months, not years, to find a new foundation for dollar dominance. Without that foundation, American economic hegemony would collapse, taking the empire's global influence with it. The opportunity came wrapped in catastrophe. On October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel during the holiest day of the Jewish calendar. The Yom Kippur War erupted across the Middle East, and within days the conflict had drawn in the superpowers. America rushed weapons and supplies to Israel. The Soviet Union backed Egypt and Syria. But the most devastating weapon wasn't fired from a tank or dropped from a plane. It came from the oil fields of the Arabian Peninsula. On October 17, 1973, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries announced an oil embargo against any nation supporting Israel. Overnight, oil prices didn't just rise, they exploded. A barrel that had cost $3 suddenly cost $12. Gas stations across America ran dry. Drivers waited in lines that stretched for blocks. The economy that had dominated the world for 3 decades was brought to its knees by a handful of oil producers who had decided to weaponize their black gold. But Henry Kissinger, Nixon's Secretary of State, saw something others missed. The same crisis that was strangling the American economy was making the oil producers unimaginably rich. Saudi Arabia alone was earning more money in a single year than its entire economy had produced just a decade earlier. By 1974, the kingdom's current account surplus reached 51% of its gross domestic product. Money was pouring into Saudi coffers faster than the royal family could spend it, and that money had to go somewhere. Kissinger realized that if he could direct those oil profits back into the American financial system, the crisis that threatened to destroy dollar dominance could become the foundation of something far more powerful. Instead of backing the dollar with gold, America would back it with oil. Every gallon of gasoline, every barrel of crude, every drop of petroleum consumed anywhere on Earth would require dollars to purchase. The world's addiction to energy would become America's financial lifeline. The negotiations began in secret. Kissinger met with Saudi officials in luxury hotels and private estates, far from the cameras and crowds that might have exposed the true nature of the discussions. The Americans offered something the Saudis desperately needed: military protection. The kingdom sat on the world's largest oil reserves, but it had a tiny population and a military that couldn't defend those riches against larger, more aggressive neighbors. Iran was building a formidable military with American weapons. Iraq had ambitions that stretched far beyond its borders. The Soviet Union was expanding its influence across the region. Saudi Arabia needed a protector, and America needed a solution to its dollar crisis. The marriage was natural, but the terms required delicate negotiation. On June 8, 1974, the United States and Saudi Arabia signed the formal agreement establishing the Joint Commission on Economic Cooperation. The public document spoke of infrastructure development, technology transfer, and economic partnership. But the real deal was negotiated in private, sealed with handshakes and promises that wouldn't be revealed for decades. Saudi Arabia would ensure that oil was priced and sold in dollars. The kingdom would use its influence to convince other oil producers to follow the same practice. And most crucially, the Saudis would take their enormous oil profits and invest them in American Treasury bonds, creating artificial demand for both dollars and American debt. In exchange, the United States would provide military protection, advanced weapons, and the guarantee that the House of Saud would remain in power no matter what challenges arose. The genius of this arrangement went far beyond a simple trade agreement. What Kissinger and the Saudi leadership had created was a self-reinforcing cycle that would reshape global power for generations. Every nation that needed oil would first need dollars. Every dollar earned from oil sales would flow back into American financial markets, and every threat to this system would trigger the full force of American military might. The petrodollar wasn't just a currency arrangement. It was the architecture of a new form of empire, one built not on territorial conquest but on financial dependency. By 1975, the transformation was complete. Every member of OPEC had agreed to price their oil exclusively in dollars. The countries that controlled the world's energy supply had become willing partners in maintaining American financial dominance. The mechanics were elegant in their simplicity. When Japan needed oil, it had to buy dollars first. When Germany imported petroleum, it strengthened the dollar's global demand. When developing nations sought energy for their growing economies, they were forced to accumulate dollar reserves and integrate their financial systems with American banks. The crisis that had threatened to end dollar hegemony had instead made it more powerful than ever. The recycling process that followed was unprecedented in scale and secrecy. Saudi Arabia began purchasing American Treasury bonds in quantities that dwarfed previous foreign investments. But these purchases weren't conducted through normal auction processes where other bidders could compete. Instead, the Treasury created special arrangements that allowed the Saudis to buy directly, often at preferential rates. The purchases were so large that by 1977, Saudi Arabia held nearly 20% of all Treasury bonds owned by foreign governments. Yet this massive investment remained hidden from public view, lumped together with 14 other nations under the generic category of oil exporters. The American government had found a way to finance its spending without revealing the true extent of its dependence on Saudi money. The military component of the deal proved equally transformative. American forces began establishing permanent bases across the Persian Gulf region. Bahrain became home to the Fifth Fleet. Qatar hosted major Air Force operations. The United Arab Emirates provided logistics and staging areas. Kuwait offered strategic positioning. And Saudi Arabia itself became a fortress of American military technology, with advanced radar systems, fighter jets, and missile defense networks, all designed to protect the kingdom's oil infrastructure. The message to potential rivals was clear. Any threat to the oil producers would be met with overwhelming American force. The Soviet Union, which had been expanding its influence across the Middle East, suddenly found itself locked out of the region's most valuable prize. The economic benefits for America were staggering. The trade deficits that had seemed so threatening in the early 1970s became manageable when other nations needed dollars to buy energy. American inflation, which had been spiraling upward, was contained as foreign demand absorbed the excess dollars being printed. The Federal Reserve gained unprecedented flexibility to manage the domestic economy because international demand for dollars remained constant regardless of American monetary policy. Most importantly, the United States could run deficits that would have bankrupted any other nation because those deficits were automatically financed by countries that had no choice but to accumulate dollars. The petrodollar system created the most sophisticated wealth transfer mechanism in human history, one that continues to shape every economic crisis and geopolitical conflict today. What began as a desperate response to the collapse of Bretton Woods became the foundation of American empire for the next 5 decades. But empires built on financial engineering face the same fate as those built on military conquest. They endure until the day they don't. And today, as China dumps treasury bonds, as BRICS nations explore alternative payment systems, and as oil producers quietly diversify their reserves, the cracks in the petrodollar foundation are becoming impossible to ignore. The deal that saved American hegemony in 1974 may be the same deal that destroys it in the coming decade. History doesn't repeat, but if you understand the patterns, you can see the next collapse coming long before it arrives. If this opened your eyes to how power really works, hit subscribe. Every empire leaves clues, and the next one is already forming.